There the dear little isle on the western ocean, an island of purity, holy and grand. Its name leads its daughters and songs with emotion when her on the shores of a far distant land. 'Tis Ireland, my country, the birthplace of heroes, the home of the patriot, warrior and chill, of burden of chieftain, whose name's living story, may they rest forever on history's page.
1921 was a turbulent period in the history of our country. In this short documentary, we focus on the story of the brave West Connemara flying column and their ambush on the RIC at Screeb, Connemara. The Royal Irish Constabulary was an occupying paramilitary force, heavily armed, aggressive and the willing frontline soldiers of the British Empire. From 1822 to August the 31st, 1922, when the RIC was disbanded, over 85,000 Irishmen had served in the ranks of the Royal Irish Constabulary. RIC personnel were mainly from working class backgrounds and over 80% Catholic. Senior ranks within the force was reserved for the Protestant Unionist ruling class. This Catholic force maintained the class and sectarian social order for the ruling British Empire elite here in Ireland for almost 100 years. From the very beginning of the formation of the RIC, they could not be more different from their fellow police officers in England. The London Bobby, for example, carried a truncheon. The RIC constable here in Ireland was equipped with a Winchester pump-action shotgun with 5 rounds in the magazine, a revolver and a truncheon. By 1901, there were around 1,600 barracks and 11,000 RIC constables in Ireland. In 1904, the British government issued the constables of the Royal Irish Constabulary with 10,000 powerful and modern Lee Enfield rifles. Constables of the Royal Irish Constabulary were responsible for the assassination of elected Irish politicians, the brutal torture of Republican prisoners, the murder of civilians, assisted in mass evictions, burned and looted towns and villages across this land. Without doubt, these were desperate times during the War of Independence from 1919 to July 1921. The stakes were high. Sir Thomas Hammer Greenwood, Chief Secretary of State to Ireland and incidentally the last Secretary of State, justified the murder and brutality by Crown forces as a price to be paid in crushing and defeating the IRA. Success by the IRA, he stated, would mean the beginning of the breakup of the British Empire and our civilization. In the autumn of 1920, Richard Mulcahy, Chief of Staff of the IRA, came to stay in Thomas O'Malley's home in Kilmilkin at Mam. Richard Mulcahy travelled under an assumed name and while in Kilmilkin met with Battalion OC P.J. MacDonald. They discussed various ways of reorganising Connemara, which at the time was part of the Galway Brigade. The outcome of the discussions was that Connemara was divided into the West and East Connemara brigades. Subsequently, a meeting was held in Leenan in November 1920, and the West Connemara Brigade was divided into 4 battalions. The Leenan Battalion, OC Thomas O'Malley, Rossmuck, OC Colm O'Gara, Roundstone OC Jim King, and Clifton OC Gerald Barkley, and Brigade OC was P.J. MacDonald. Battalion OCs were instructed to get organised, get active, raid for arms, set up their flying columns as quickly as possible. The time had come to terrorise the terrorist. Connemara was going to war with the Empire. At the end of March in 1921, Pádraig Ó Máille from Winterone and John Feehan visited Colm O'Gara, OC of Rosmuck. John Feehan, Divisional Quartermaster, found Colm O'Gara extremely ill at his sister's house at Inver. Colm O'Gara gave them a report of the RIC movements in Rosmuck and the Commas area. The decision was made to ambush the constables on the road between Screeb Junction and Mam Cross. It was also decided to move Colm O'Gara for his own safety to a safe house before the ambush took place. Connemara was probably late coming to the War of Independence, and that was due probably to circumstances beyond their control. But when the West Connemara Flying Column finally entered the war per se, under the battalions and the brigades that were set up, they seem to have been extremely successful. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, what was very interesting, you had 4 or 5 big engagements between Westport and Screeb. So you had Clifton, Screeb, Muncherone, Carroll-Kennedy and Tourmakeady. And of course they're operating within one of the most difficult terrains for a flying column to be operating, because you're dealing with a population that is probably one of the least well off in the country at the time. There's still a gentry loyalist presence in the area, and the people are extremely poor. So they have a whole network of support base. So there's a lot of things going against them, but what they have going for them is a big support base locally in every little. No matter how poor the area is they're in, they've got enough families that will support them at their own. So it really. And of course, unlike what people say that there were poor creators, the flying column represents, like most flying columns, you had an intellectual core to it, provided by the O'Malleyas and a number of other families who were the old Gaelic elite, who weren't happy to be part of the British elite when they could have their own country. And then you had young men, typical age, who joined the army for adventure, single men.
Those were men that were overseas fighting with the British.
Yeah, and then you have people who are working in shops. So these were a whole cross-section of Connemara society, and they were from all over Connemara. They were from Roundstone, from Rosmuck, Leenane, a big contingent, the Man Valley, handful from Clifton. So they were really like a microcosm of Connemara society, But they had difficult times. But one of the things that strikes you about them when you're reading their accounts of them, some of them were very humorous, some of them were quite cynical, but they were all very religious. They were steeped in Catholicism. That was the culture. We forget now, we grew up in that culture ourselves as kids, but there's very few young people now who experience that very devotional church, with the church and the minister, the priest rather, being a powerful, physically and politically powerful figure locally. So, as they were going out to attack men, they said their prayers every chance they got, particularly when they were passing holy wells. And we have a lovely account of them stopping en route from Muncherone, heading down to Recess, stopping at Toberforig.
At Momain.
At Momain. And we have another amazing account of them at night. They're on the run going north to Bengurham, into Glendavach, into the next valley, and then up onto the mountains overlooking Glenlower, where they're in sight of Crowpatrick. And on a windswept mountain ridge, they say the Rosary. Colm O'Gara and Pádraig Ó Máille lead the Rosary. And they're freezing up on top of the mountain. But it's a lovely, and of course it's a way of binding them together. They're in danger. It's a way of, that's what prayer does. It brings people, gives them folk on higher things. They're cold and they're wet. They're in danger. There's a whole encirclement being planned and operational at the time by a big, almost 1,000 British troops hunting them down. And so they know these prayers are important because they mightn't survive another day if they get caught.
Yeah, because I read in one of those reports that you were talking about that a priest had told, I believe, John Feehan, that 2 members of his flying column had come to him to ask for forgiveness before they killed somebody, just in case.
Yeah, they went to the priest, and the priest said to the bishop, and the bishop came to have a word with them, saying, there isn't a war on. and he said, you can only shoot people in context of war. A war hasn't been declared. And the answer back was said, well, it mightn't be declared, but we are at war. We are entitled to shoot.
And I think he also said, that the priests didn't speak out about the other side when they actually used to shoot civilians or people who were not necessarily at war with them either.
But it was, the bishop was, the clergy, the Catholic clergy, historically have not been supportive of the national cause. You have individual priests, but, unless they're coming from the upper classes of Irish society and they're conservative and they want to maintain the status quo as far as possible.
Because they were threatened with excommunication on a regular basis, weren't they, Mike?
Oh yeah, and they were excommunicated.
And they were excommunicated.
Later, during the Civil War, yes.
During the Civil War.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a tough time.
But any chance they got, they said their prayers, they went to Mass, they had clergy meeting them, there was a number of priests supportive of them.
They were good Catholic boys at the end of the day.
But they were denounced also for shooting the two good Catholic RIC men in Clifton. And that was Canon McAlpine laid into them, saying that it was an unjust murder. And he made no bones about calling it murder either.
Yes.
So, perception changes, of course, in the course of history. But at the time, there were revolutionaries from a cross-section, but they were led by very brave and intelligent men.
They were seriously brave, there's no doubt about it. On the 5th of April, 1921, the West Connemara Flying Column moved south from their base in Glonglash. The logistics of moving the column undetected over miles of bog, mountains and streams was always going to be extremely risky. So what we have is the map of Connemara, and just in order to show our viewers the scale and the distance and the logistics that the flying column had to move along back in 1921, it was enormous. So if you look at Leenan, just a little bit north of us, and PJ MacDonald had gathered all of the volunteers here at Glonglash in the Mam area, and that would have been early on the day of the 5th of April 1921. So the column moved along until they reached Maumgauna, and they passed over the mountain there, still heading south until they hit the Pilgrim Trail, which brings them on to Maumain, where there's a pilgrim site to St. Patrick. We would imagine, being that they were good Catholics, that they would have stopped there to pray for a successful mission. Moving along and skirting around the hill at Crooknahillen, they reached the road here at Urad, which would have been probably their most dangerous point, because this was the main road and still is on the Galway to Clifton route. So once they got across the road, they were back into miles and miles of bog again, and passing through bog and river, they passed Shonavera, on to Crookadav, and finally reaching Gortmore late in the evening in Russmuck. Now when they reached Gortmore, they were met by local volunteers who took them along about 2 miles, a little slightly east of there, into a village called Dedawanov. And Dedawanov was the village of Captain Pat Gagan, and there was only 2 houses in the village at the time. So when they arrived in Dedawanov, the flying column was split again. Some of the lads were taken over to Glontrosna, and they had been given explicit instructions by Captain Pat Gagan to be back at his house in Dedawanov before daybreak the next day, and that would have been the 6th of April 1921, where the ambush was to take place. The path walked by a revolutionary is a long and lonely one. There is a constant possibility of betrayal and capture. Colm O'Gara described this well in his book Misha, that was published in 1943. I travelled a twilight world, moving constantly between a success of safe houses and hideouts under the cover of darkness. This was our life, the life of a volunteer. On the 6th of April 1921, the West Connemara Flying Brigade, under the command of P.J. MacDonald, lay in wait east of Screeb Junction on the Mam Cross Road to ambush a patrol of 5 constables of the Royal Irish Constabulary, who were on their return journey to their barracks at Mam, 16.5 kilometres away. This was a well-planned military operation. The RIC patrol were cycling unaware into a deadly trap. The volunteers were given orders not to open fire until the 5 constables were within the ambush circle. PJ MacDonald and Gerald Barclay were to be the first armed position to open fire, thus signalling the other armed positions to commence firing on the RIC patrol. Today we're standing here at the ambush site, and this is in the history books as the Screeb Ambush by the West Connemara flying column under the command of P.J. MacDonald. So the men had waited all day for the RIC patrol to return to their barracks at Mam, which is in this direction here behind me along the road. The ambush party at that time, when they spied the 5 RIC officers on their way back from Letchamore and the Collia, they would have known at the time that they were about 2 miles away, and they would have come along and they would have come on the road here, coming east from the Screeb junction right back here. According to the eyewitness statement of Captain P.J. MacDonald to the Bureau of Military History, 4 volunteers armed with shotguns took up position in the vicinity of this now in ruins little Protestant church. P.J. MacDonald in a statement described this as the Grove, and this ambush position is on the north side of the Mam Cross Road. Here behind this large rock at the entrance to Dedawano village, P.J. MacDonald, Gerard Barclay and 2 shotgun men took up their positions while they were laying in wait for the RIC patrol. Now, according to P.J. MacDonald, Pádraig O'Malley and Richard Joyce were in their ambush position just across the road here, about maybe 50 metres or so away from them. Jim King and a shotgun man were posted about 60 metres east of P.J. MacDonald's position, using whatever cover they could find away from the road in the bog. This was the last ambush position along the Mam Cross Road. John Feehan, Pat Wallace and 2 local volunteers lay in wait here behind in this clump of rocks. They were armed with 2 rifles and 2 shotguns, and according to John Feehan, they also had blocked the road with the horse cart that they had commandeered earlier in the day from a local man on his way to Russmuck. Between John Feehan's position and Jim King, Captain Pat Gagan and his brother, along with Pat O'Neill, took up position on the north side of the Mam Cross Road, trying to find as much cover as they possibly could in the bog. Now, we know that according to the statements that there was at least 18 volunteers present at the Screeb Ambush, and unfortunately we don't have all the names of those brave men. John Feehan says in his eyewitness statement to the Bureau of Military History that on the day of the ambush, he says, "At last the first policeman came on the scene, passed the rear of the column and came on for 100 yards. Then another followed, and to my horror I heard a shot from the Grove side, and some distance nearer to me, where the OC placed men behind a large rock, I heard another shot, and yet another, and smoke coming from behind this rock." So unfortunately, the ambush was totally compromised. The 3 constables at the rear, they turned and fled towards Screeb Lodge for safety, obviously. There was a volley of shots fired in their direction, and the first constable, who was also the sergeant in charge of the patrol, he jumped, or possibly maybe fell from his bike and rolled off to the side of the road. At the same time, he opened fire on P.J. MacDonald and Gerard Barclay's position. Now, John Feehan at this time says in a statement that he opened fire from his position, which was east along the road, on the Mam Cross Road in the direction of the sergeant. Now, the sergeant probably at this time, when he was pinned down and shots coming from both sides on him, he realised that he was surrounded. At this time, he pretended that he was wounded, and he pleaded for his life, which was actually spared. And one of the volunteers goes on to say that this was probably a gesture that, if the roles were reversed, would not be reciprocated. The second constable just dropped his bike and his revolver and took off and fled across the bog to safety. Constable William Pearson, fleeing along with the other 2 constables for safety towards Screeb Lodge, was shot through the lungs. William Pearson died from gunshot wounds he received that day at the Screeb Ambush. Between 1919 and 1921, 418 Royal Irish Constabulary personnel lost their lives during the war for Ireland's independence. It's hard to believe 100 years on, that just being here in this beautiful, quiet little setting in the Grove area, the tragic events of that day. The ambush overall was compromised. The flying column had to regroup quickly and start their long trek back to base. Retaliation and revenge followed swiftly when lorry loads of black and tans and auxiliaries arrived in Rossmuck to terrorise the community. They went on a rampage of burning and looting. The homes of the Gagans and Darowanov were burned to the ground. The shop down the road in Comas was burned and looted. Porrick Pierce's little thatched cottage back in Rossmuck was set alight. Porrick and Jane Cornelius' house in Gurtmoor was also burned to the ground. Colm O'Guira's parents' house in Inver was burned to the ground. Local people were shot at, beaten and interrogated. But the brutality was counterproductive. The will of the people had hardened. There was no going back.
Should I love every blade of green grass on your mountain, every leaf on your tree, every rock on your strand. I love your green hills and your murmuring fountain. I love you, Christ, my own native land.